What does the music that a person listens to say about that person? The most pessimistic thing to say about a person's taste in music today is that music isn't a personality. Music is simply a hobby and nothing more. Attempting to make music your personality is not only seen as cringe now, but a sign that you have no personality to begin with. Well, I beg to differ, because the genre of music that I'm going to be talking about today explains a lot about me as a person. It explains my attitude, my politics, and it says a lot about my personality because of who I wanted to be when I was younger. When I was in my early 20s, I wanted to be a punk rock star. What is it about this genre of music that got me into the mood to do big and bold things in my early 20s? Today I'm here to explain my favorite genre of music, and I'm going to get a little political, so if any of the things that I'm going to be talking about today in this video are not suitable for you, then you can just fuck off and go away. This genre of music and this video isn't meant for you. But still, if you are still here, then let's take a trip through time. Back in the late 60s and the early 70s, a lot of rock music in America was shaped by the acid fuel hippie movement that was taking place in the West. You see, hippies were rich stoner liberals who were attempting to run away from how restrictive and bigoted America was. They opted to live away from society, and in the late 60s, this movement inspired bands such as The Doors and the MC5. These artists were inspired by the traditional staples of rock and roll, sex, drugs, and hard-sounding music. But the sound of music that the hippie movement started was a sound that didn't click with everyone. Although bands like The Doors, The Beatles, and the MC5 were popular at the time, the youth of America weren't all rich hippies running away from mommy and daddy. So instead of pot-smoking intellectuals, a different subculture formed in this country. In the early 70s, coming out of the dirtiest club of New York, CBGB's, music started to get louder, angrier, and more focused on appealing to the real youth of America. Bands like The Velvet Underground, Richard Hell, and The Stooges were bands that are inspired by sex and drugs, but instead of being just stupid rock and roll, these bands wanted to make a statement. Bands like the New York Dolls consisted of cross-dressers singing about gender identity, while bands like Johnny Thunders and Richard Hell sung about not fitting into one's generation and, well, being born a loser. This generation of music is often referred to as proto-punk, before punk. Music that isn't quite punk, but just at the edge of hard rock and roll. Then in 1974, things changed. 4 fuck-ups from Queens, New York came together to form what is probably one of the most influential bands of all time, the Ramones. This band was the true beginning of what was known as punk rock. Fast-sounding rock music whose themes revolved around horror movies, sniffing glue, and not fitting in.
How about a song like Now I Want to Sniff Some Glue? What do you want to say about that?
Now I want to have something to do. Now I want to sniff some glue.
Now I want to sniff some glue. Now I want to have something to do.
In the mid-70s, more bands started to come out of America and even London that soon followed the punk rock sound of the Ramones. Bands like the Dead Boys, The Clash, and the Sex Pistols were bands that spat on the hippie movement of the 1960s. Gone was the look of appearing like an intellectual with the aid of marijuana. Now, these bands were louder, angrier, and more so about appealing to the real rebel youth of America. That's why I love the Ramones and I like the Sex Pistols too. But an underrated band that I think you should listen to from this era is a band called the Weirdos. Another band that I really love from this era too is an English band by the name of The Damned. One of the most defining things about 70s punk rock is that although these artists attempted to have a harder and heavier sound than the bands of the 60s, all of this music still sounded like an homage to the classic rock of the 60s. Even the cover of the iconic album London Calling by The Clash was an homage to Elvis Presley. Now, of course, I like the music of this era, even dating back to the Velvet Underground and the Stooges of the early 70s, but sadly, my favorite era of punk rock has to be the 80s and early 90s punk rock scene. Let's fast forward to the 1980s and let's talk about some extreme topics. Mainly, let's talk about the artist G.G. Allin. Born Jesus Christ Allin, G.G. Allin was a punk rock star who pushed the limitations of what a person could do on stage as an entertainer. G.G. Allin's music revolved around many gross and mature topics. Topics such as scat, golden showers, silent G grape, murder, and being addicted to hard drugs such as heroin and meth. G.G. Allin was an offensive entertainer, doing things on stage such as shitting and pissing himself. G.G. Allin would also cut himself and would break bottles on his body. G.G. was also a man who was in and out of prison, and he was also a man who was best friends with the famous serial killer John Wayne Gacy. In my opinion, this man is the essence of punk rock, a nihilistic outlaw who sees the world as his pincushion. Gigi's behavior is often seen as horrible and misrepresentative of punk rock, but I beg to differ. I believe that G.G. Allin actually represents the true nature of punk rock in America. G.G. Allin was a true rebel who believed in nothing but want and destruction. Although G.G. is a bad person in a lot of respects, his attitude is what punk rock is at its core. What G.G. Allin created was punk rock at its core. Now let's talk about the other punk rock bands of the 1980s. Similar to G.G. Allin, many bands of the 80s chose to be more offensive than their 1970s counterparts. Bands like Black Flag sung about topics such as alcoholism, lack of mental health,
I'm about to have a nervous breakdown. My head really hurts.
and even lewd sexual behavior.
Say you don't want it, you don't want it. Say you don't want it, then you slipping on it.
Punk rock had become more political than previous other artists of the 1970s, with bands like the Dead Kennedys. One of the Dead Kennedys' most well-known tracks that really pushes the idea that punk is political was the song Nazi Punks Fuck Off. Now we have to get into what is known as Nazi punk rock. What is Nazi punk rock? Although I do enjoy the offensive works and music of G.G. Allin, Nazi punk is the opposite of what punk rock is about. Nazi punk is pro-fascist. Fascism is an ideology that not only agrees with the status quo of society, but it's also an ideology that allows the government to tell us what to do, think, and say. Fascism is a terrible and racist ideology, so punk rock modeled after the Nazi movement of World War II is just simply sad. Nazi punk is a conformist ideology disguised as rebellion. Back in the 1970s, bands like the Sex Pistols, as well as other punk rockers, started to wear swastika patches to rebel against their elders, who were most likely World War II veterans. This type of rebellion inspired real Nazis to form their own subgenre within the annals of punk. Sadly, this form of punk rock is still around, and in some ways was one of the reasons as to why punk rock started to die off in the mainstream in the mid-80s. Punk rock was supposedly becoming misogynistic in the mid-80s. Punk rock bands like Fear came out with tracks like The Mouth Don't Stop.
The trouble today with women, the mouth don't stop.
Okay, so let's have some real talk here, because I'm sick and tired of hearing people hating on the 80s in general. Although it is true that people did get away with a lot of terrible things in the 80s, such as sexual assault and Silent G rape.
Cocaine's a hell of a drug.
There was also a lot of creative freedom that artists had during this era. The same goes for punk rock, because although there was this macho attitude of sounding harder and heavier, there was also this attitude of finding freedom through anger and aggression. Bands such as the Dirty Rotten Imbeciles was a band that dealt with serious and intelligent topics such as freedom of speech, gun control, and even the school system. One of my favorite punk bands, and one of my favorite bands of all time in general, Bad Religion, came out of the early to late 80s scene of hardcore political punk rock. This band is the reason as to why I love punk more than any other genre. This band is the most political, loudest, and angriest band that I have ever heard of in my life, and I love this band for that reason. This band is my education and my intelligence. There are no other artists that I can think of besides the bands and artists of the 1990s that are this deep and poetic as Bad Religion. There are many layers to this band, but to cut straight to the chase, this band is smart. This band is fronted by a man with a college degree, so there are a lot of songs about subjects such as death and mortality, flat earthers, politics, and society. These songs are worth listening to on the basis that you would want to challenge your intelligence. Other bands from the 1980s that are worth mentioning are bands such as Minor Threat, The Circle Jerks, Black Flag, The Descendants, and the all-fronted black band Bad Brains. And though I did mention the band Fear as a misogynist group, their offensive lyrics are still worth listening to if you enjoy the genre of punk rock. Fear the record is still a classic punk rock album that's still worth listening to. Listen, great music can come out of the mouths of an edgy, angry person. Now, when it comes to something like Nazi punk, even if you make that music sound good in some way, the message is still not worth it, and it's much more important to not allow that message to exist. So I'll take misogyny in the form of punk rock any day of the week rather than no punk at all. Now it's time to fast forward to the 90s and finally get into the biggest argument that punk fans get into. What is punk and what isn't punk? One of the most influential artists of this era, Nirvana, was a band that was about introducing people to underground rock music. In the 90s, the sound of punk was no longer a commercially viable sound, so instead grunge took its place. Nirvana was a punk-sounding band, but grunge was the new alternative flavor of that decade. Still, one important thing to mention is that Nirvana's frontman, Kurt Cobain, was actually a fan of punk rock music, citing bands such as Iggy and the Stooges, Millions of Dead Cops, and Black Flag as one of his favorite artists. Kurt Cobain's style of dirty rock and roll music wasn't the only type of music that dominated the airwaves in the 90s. After Kurt Cobain committed suicide in 1994, the band Green Day would soon dominate the radio as the newest alternative flavor of that decade. Punk is a word that can be applied to a lot of things, and I think that the band Green Day started out as a punk rock band, but soon later became a hard rock sounding band later in their career. I would even go as far as to call the album American Idiot a punk rock record. A lot of Green Day's early albums, 29/Smooth, Kerplunk, and Dookie, are punk rock albums in their purest form.
Here we go again, infatuation touches me just when I thought that it would end.
Okay, here we go. It's time to talk about what's punk and what's not punk. The age-old argument that's been started since the dawn of punk rock. You see, since punk has been around, there has been this mentality that punk rockers carry. Are you a true punk rocker, outcast rebel with safety pins in your ear and spiked up hair? Or are you a poser who is only dressing up as a punk rocker for fashion? One of the best movies that hits home for me is the movie SLC Punk, a movie that is about a punk rocker in the 80s played by Matthew Lillard dealing with his own identity issues involving his mentality of what punk really means to him and who he is as a person. If you want to understand the subculture of punk really well, then I would suggest watching this movie. Punk people can be stuck-up babies, and at one point I used to be one of those people. I really hated the Clash and the Sex Pistols at one point in my life because I wanted to be more unique than any other punker. Almost everyone in the punk community talks about these two bands, so it made sense for me at the time to not like these bands out of spite. Nowadays, these bands are now my favorites to listen to, so it really says a lot about me that I wasn't willing to give these bands a chance when I was 22. In the 90s, punk was no longer just punk. Now it was being called pop punk. Or if you want to be a real 90s kid, there was also ska punk. Ska punk was punk rock sounding music mixed in with the sounds of reggae and ska. Bands like NoFX, Goldfinger, Real Big Fish, Rancid, The Offspring, and the previously mentioned Green Day were at the forefront of what was the new wave of 90s punk rock / pop punk. I liked most of these bands, but gone was the nihilistic attitude of previous punk rock bands. Now punk was more about being a goofball, and the music of the 90s really reflected that. Punk had become a commercial success in the 90s, and bands like Green Day did their best to popularize this alternative sound. It's easier to say that pop punk lasted longer than just the 90s. In the 2000s, there existed more pop punk bands such as Blink-182, Sum 41, and one of my personal favorites, Rise Against. One of the most common sayings that has come up over the years is the saying that punk is dead. While it is true that punk rock bands are older and less relevant now, punk rock is still a well-listened to genre. Despite the anger, the bad history, and the obscureness of punk rock, punk is still one of my favorite genres that I continue to listen to this very day. When I was 22, I used to be a patch-wearing jacket punk rocker, so this genre will always be close to my heart. If I'm going to end this video in any proper way, it would be by naming my top 10 favorite punk records of all time. So let's get the fuck out of here, and in no particular order, here are my top 10 favorite punk records. The Descendants, Milo Goes to College. This is a real good album that's catchy and filled with a lot of topics that punk doesn't really deal with, like marriage and the frustrations of having a job and having to work 40 hours a week. This is definitely an album that you can label as pop punk, and I would even recommend this album as an introduction to punk rock in general. The Misfits, Static Age. This album is banger after banger of hard and heavy songs. The songs on this album are very gruesome and mature. Songs about Silent G Grape, the murder of JFK, and horror movies, this album is a fucked up killer record, worth listening to. Rancid, Out Come the Wolves. This is just a fun record in general. That's the best way I can describe this album. It's catchy and it's filled with a lot of different types of punk rock genres like ska and traditional hardcore punk. Bad Religion, Suffer. Probably one of the smartest and most heavy sounding albums. I was caught up between this and the album Against the Grain, so when I say that this album is the shit, I mean it. This album is punk in its purest form, and I would recommend this album to anyone looking into getting into the genre. Operation Ivy, Energy. Another great album filled with different styles of punk. I like ska, so this album was a no-brainer for me to pick. A fun album. Off, Wasted Years. Heavy and catchy sounding Hollywood punk rock at its finest. The songs on this album hit hard and the heavy sound never stops. The Damned, Machine Gun Etiquette. This is an incredibly underrated album in general, and I would even go as far as to say that if you're starting to listen to punk for the first time, this album is a catchy and fun starter album. Horror punk is the genre that I would label this album under. Minor Threat, Complete Discography. Just an album of hardcore sounding punk rock songs. In fact, I would say that this album is so heavy sounding that it is a hard album to get into for a beginner, so tread lightly with this one. Green Day, Dookie. This is a really fun album, and I would also recommend this as a starter album as well. This album's lyrics are very stupid, but I love this album for that reason. Punk doesn't have to be about politics all the time. Finally, we have Fugazi, 13 Songs. This is a high-concept band, and they might be a little bit of a pretentious act, but I really love this record. It's worth listening to this album because it's a smart album, and for that reason alone, I really like it. That's not to say that the songs aren't still catchy on this album, but the album itself is a strange sounding album. Still one of my favorites. Alright, so we're pretty much done with this video. If you were informed on any of the things that I talked about in this video, please tell me in the comments. I enjoyed writing and editing this video, so tell me if you're convinced that punk is a genre for you, or maybe it's a little too extreme for you to listen to. Anyways, goodbye.